There are two big misconceptions and myths that I hear so commonly about PTSD. This is often why people think that they have this diagnosis when they don't.
A lot of guys lost more than just a leg.
You lose some friends?
Well, that too, but I'm talking about the guys that lived. They can't seem to get right.
Yeah.
Even when you're here, you're not here. I see you, feel you, but you're not here.
For this kind of video, I'm going to put in a trigger warning and say that if you've experienced any kind of trauma, that this video could be very triggering for you. I'll be talking about some different types and sometimes going into a little bit of detail. So if you've experienced anything that might be traumatic, any type of abuse, anything like that, this might be a good video to skip. So just take care of yourself and make your own decisions from there. Okay, the first misconception is the idea that PTSD is common. Now, about 70% of people will experience some kind of trauma in their life. So trauma itself is incredibly common, but the brain is also incredibly resilient. The National Center for PTSD estimates that about 6 to 7% of Americans, so people in the US, will have a lifetime diagnosis of PTSD, and globally that estimate drops to about 4%. We went from 70% of people that experience trauma to 6% that get a PTSD diagnosis, and less depending on where you live. That's a big difference. So developing PTSD is not the normal trajectory for people that experience trauma. What we expect is that people actually recover. That's not to say that whatever traumatic event happened to you might not change the way that you think, that you feel, the way that you live your life, but it is saying that the symptoms that I'll talk about later in this video are not expected to occur past a certain amount of time. And let's talk about that timing. There's a diagnosis called acute stress disorder. It's basically the exact same symptoms as PTSD, but to get this diagnosis, it's expected that you have these symptoms anywhere from 3 days to 1 month after experiencing a trauma. To get a diagnosis of PTSD, you had to have had symptoms for more than a month after experiencing a trauma. The percent of people that have acute stress disorder ranges from 6 to 30%. But again, looking back at the 70% of people that experience a trauma, the fact that only 30% of people might show symptoms after 3 days, that should blow your mind. I mean, it blows mine, honestly. Again, the brain is incredibly resilient. After 3 days to 1 month of experiencing something incredibly horrific, the brain adjusts and recovers. And I truly hope that me saying that PTSD is uncommon, rather than feeling invalidating, for a few of you can actually feel somewhat comforting. The majority of you watching this experienced the trauma, according to the statistics, and maybe there are a good bit of you that did bounce back after a few days. Because of this, maybe friends or family judge how quickly it seemed like you got over the situation. Or maybe you're judging yourself because it seems like you're just able to really pretty easily carry on and continue living your life. People might have told you to go and seek therapy, to talk to somebody, but maybe you felt like you truly didn't need to. There wasn't and isn't anything wrong with you. This is what we expect to happen. I think the reason that a lot of people believe this misconception is because when you do experience some kind of traumatic event, it does change the way that you live your life. Maybe you nearly drowned as a kid, so you avoid going near any kind of bodies of water. Or maybe you got into a really serious car accident, so you avoid driving. That does not mean that you have PTSD, though. It's so common, especially in the US, to throw around these mental health terms for anything, right? To say that, I'm so OCD because you can't stand mess or clutter, or to say she's so bipolar because a person might have mood swings, or to say I have PTSD over X because now you avoid doing something that almost took your life at one point. That's not actually how these things work. So if anyone is on your back for how you're responding to your drama, send them to this video. I got you. And if you're on your own back for how you're responding to drama, Stop it. Respectfully. Okay, the next misconception is that no matter what kind of trauma you faced, that you could potentially get a PTSD diagnosis from it. That is not the case at all. According to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders that we use in the US, we mental health professionals use in the US to diagnose mental health disorders. In order to get a diagnosis of PTSD, the trauma that you suffered has to have involved exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. These things can either have happened directly to you or you directly experienced it. You witnessed it happen to somebody else in person, so you were actually there witnessing it, or you found out, like you heard about this happening to a close friend or family member. And for the last one about hearing about it happening to a close friend or family member, this can't be through things like electronic media, so TV or socials or any kind of pictures, unless it's work related. So say if you work for the FBI and you come across a bunch of pictures that show like your best friend that has been offed in just a brutal and violent way, that is something that could count towards getting a PTSD diagnosis. But not just because you're a true crime girly and watch a lot of the videos and so see a lot of pictures of people who've maybe been dismembered or whatever else. That would not fit into this category. Now, that might still not be clear in terms of what would count as a trauma that can get this diagnosis. So I'm going to put up and go through what's known as the Life Events Checklist, which was created from the National Center of PTSD. And I'll also put a link to the PDF as well in the description, but I'll just read it off for you. It's very comprehensive and very specific in terms of trauma that would fit into these categories and warrant a PTSD diagnosis. So the first one that we have is talking about a natural disaster, so like what I'm experiencing now while I'm filming this. So for example, flood, hurricanes, tornadoes, or earthquake, a fire or explosion, some kind of transportation accident. So, for example, a car accident, boat accident, train wreck, plane crash, serious accident at work, home, or during some kind of recreational activity, exposure to toxic substance. So, for example, dangerous chemicals or radiation, some kind of physical assault. So, being attacked, hit, kicked, slapped, beaten up. Assault with a weapon. So, that could be being shot, stabbed, threatened with a knife, gun, bomb, some kind of sexual assault, and you can see the different examples there. Other unwanted or uncomfortable sexual experience. Combat or exposure to a war zone, so either in the military or as a civilian, maybe you made it through some kind of war when you were a kid or were in a war-torn country. Captivity, so being kidnapped, abducted, held hostage, a POW. Life-threatening illness or injury. Severe human suffering, sudden violent death, so for example, homicide, suicide, sudden accidental death, serious injury, harm, or death you caused to someone else, and then any other very stressful event or experience. I've had many people tell me things that do not fit on this list, and one that comes to mind right away that's incredibly common is divorce. Now, there's a lot about that process that is obviously very traumatic for a lot of people involved. So it makes sense that when people come to me that they thought that they could get a diagnosis, a PTSD diagnosis because they experienced this. Unfortunately, you can't. That does not negate the impact this has on a person though. So listen to me very closely. Come here. Listen to me very, very closely. What I am not saying is that certain traumas are not as bad because you can't receive a diagnosis for them. Through a lot of research, it was found that the events listed in that life events checklist more frequently lead to people having long-term symptoms of PTSD, and those not on the checklist often don't. Now, there are two traumas from that list that make it more likely if you experience these that you might get a diagnosis of PTSD, and those ones are experiencing some kind of war or some kind of sexual violence. And that is a big reason behind why I'll be using the two films that I will today to just illustrate some of the points that I'll be talking about later when it comes to PTSD. Because when we think about it, those two things are experienced a lot, unfortunately, by people who serve in or have served in the military. And so the videos that I'll be going over today are one, American Sniper, And I wanted to use this one because I just remember, especially if you're in the US, I don't know what it was like all around the world, but this was like a wide sweeping phenomenon when it came out in 2014. Like everybody was talking about it, and I don't know, it just really, I feel like, gripped the country. So I just remember that so well, and it depicts a lot of experiences so well. So I wanted to use that. And then another film called Thank You for Your Service. I only heard about this actually not that long ago, maybe a few weeks ago when I was thinking about doing this video. It came out a few years after American Sniper, but I feel like a lot of people haven't talked about it. And although both of these films are portrayed by actors, they do depict true events. Now, going back and giving a little bit of more statistics and context for these military members and some of these traumas that they suffer, the Department of Defense, so the DoD, estimated in 2024 that about 8,000 military members, so service members at that point, had experienced some kind of sexual assault. But other studies show that these numbers reported may have been 2 to 4 times less than what actually occurred. That's because there are often negative consequences for people who do report. So, soldiers, like civilian survivors as well, are often too scared to report what happened to them. During the war in Afghanistan, some estimates reported that about 24% of active duty women and less than 2% of active duty men experienced some kind of sexual assault while serving in the military. That is 1/4 of all the US soldiers that were serving at that time. 1/4. So, unfortunately, for those who are serving or did serve in the military, they are at higher risk and experience PTSD at higher rates because they experience war and sexual violence at higher rates. However, you don't have to have been in the military to experience these things. If you experience these things outside of the military, you are susceptible to getting a diagnosis as well. So those are the two big misconceptions that I wanted to go over before jumping into more about symptoms, diagnosis, etc. Hopefully, if you watched all that and paid attention, it set a good foundation for you to understand really the meat of this video, where I'm going to dig in and talk about the ins and outs of getting a PTSD diagnosis. So why, amongst all the reasons I just mentioned, is getting a PTSD diagnosis so difficult? Well, it's because the criteria is super specific. Oh, and by the way, all the symptoms that I'm about to mention could lead to a diagnosis of PTSD for adults, teenagers, and children over the age of 6. Children under the age of 6 can be diagnosed with PTSD as well, which is so devastating, I know, but some of their symptoms are just a little bit different and they might need less of the symptoms than an adult. So that's the main difference. For a diagnosis, you usually have to have 1 to 2, at least 1 to 2, symptoms in the various categories, which are known as criterions, and there are criterions A through E. Criterion A is just actually experiencing some kind of traumatic event, so one of the ones that we had looked at that checklist before, and so that's step 1. Criterion B focuses on intrusive symptoms associated with the trauma. There are 5 symptoms in this category, and you need at least one of these symptoms to get a diagnosis. The first is having recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event or the traumatic events. A lot of adjectives, I know. So when you're awake, these memories will just pop into your head completely unprompted. So maybe you're just sitting there watching New Girl on TV, and now all of a sudden, in the next moment, you're thinking of trauma. The second is recurrent nightmares that have some content that's related to the trauma. If you're really interested in why you might have these nightmares and why you might have them in general, check out the last video that I did on sleep, in which I talk all about this. And trust me, you probably don't have the nightmares for the reason that you might think. And so check out that video after you watch this one if you are interested in hearing more about that. The third is having flashbacks. So either feeling as if or acting as if the trauma is occurring again, like you're actually back there in real time. So a person who might have experienced combat trauma and say they had to jump in the trenches for safety while they were under some kind of enemy fire. Maybe when they're at home, they might jump over the couch and it might be like they're back in the trenches protecting themselves from some kind of enemy fire. It could also be, less dramatic than that, but that is just an example of what this might look like. The fourth is intense and prolonged psychological distress that when something reminds you of the trauma. And the key word here, the key words are intense and prolonged. So of course, these events are not pleasant. So for vast majority of people, if they had some kind of memory or were reminded of these things, it wouldn't be pleasant. But for somebody who has PTSD, it takes them ages to get back to baseline. So maybe they get reminded of it and they're starting to feel extremely anxious or angry or fearful, and it takes them an hour to get back to kind of that resting state before they were reminded of it. Then the final symptom, the fifth symptom in this category, is those intense physiological reactions when you're reminded of the trauma. So that's things like your heart pounding, sweating, trouble breathing, etc. So that's Criterion B. Moving on to C. Criterion C focuses on avoidance. So avoidance of either internal or external stimuli. Now there's only 2 symptoms in this category, but you do need at least one to get a diagnosis. So one of these is avoiding or making strong efforts, strong attempts to avoid internal, so things like memories, thoughts, feelings associated with the trauma. And then the second type of avoidance is avoiding external things that can remind you of the trauma. So that could be people, places, conversations, situations, certain events, anything really, certain smells, anything that could remind you of the trauma that occurred. For example, a very, very common one that I hear is people being afraid or wary of crowds in some way, depending on what the trauma might be. And so avoiding things like malls, parties, concerts, anything where there might be a big crowd. And these efforts for avoidance, the measures that people are taking to avoid, is not convenient for folks. It's incredibly effortful and requires people to go out of their way to, at times, completely change their routine so they can avoid whatever it is that they're wanting to avoid. So examples of this may be a person that only goes to the grocery store, say at 5 a.m. on a weekday, right? They're going specifically at that time because it'll help them likely avoid the crowds. And again, this is something where people are going out of their way and changing their routine to do this. It's not necessarily that this person just likes to wake up at this time and go grocery shopping. I had a friend last year, a year and a half ago, where she would actually, on Sundays before church, she'd go to the early service, but wake up even earlier to go grocery shopping, like around 5 a.m., and just love doing that. That wouldn't count in this. That is not inconveniencing her at all, although that's crazy for me, and it definitely would inconvenience me, for sure. Or another person, for example, might take a completely different route to work every day, so maybe it adds 20 minutes more to their commute, but this way helps them avoid that billboard that they see every time that says, "Have you been in a car accident? You can get a lawyer." Maybe because they were in a car accident and seeing that reminds them of that trauma. It's not uncommon for people to avoid getting help too. In American Sniper, Bradley Cooper, who plays Chris Kyle, is pretty obviously uncomfortable talking to a guy he saved in the war. He's trying to avoid the conversation, and even when this guy mentions going to the VA, Chris is really trying to avoid that too. Getting help means talking about it. And so obviously if I'm trying to avoid this trauma, then I'm going to try to avoid talking about it too. Avoidance can take many forms, including the use of drugs and other substances to try to avoid those thoughts and memories that come up. And this is so common in PTSD because drugs are pretty effective in the short term about taking your mind off of things. Obviously, there's a lot of more long-term consequences, and I'm not advocating for the use of substances as treatment for PTSD. But I think I'm going to do a whole other video about this where I talk a little bit more about the avoidance pieces in depth and specifically about substance use as it connects to PTSD, because that is my bread and butter as working in the substance use field. And so if that's something that would interest you, please leave a comment below and let me know. All right, so that was Criterion C. So moving on to D, we just have these 2 left. Criterion D focuses on negative changes to mood and or thoughts/beliefs that are associated with the trauma. So there are 7 different symptoms in this category, and you need at least 2 to get a diagnosis. The first symptom is an inability to remember important aspects of the trauma. This can happen because in some people, the brain will try to protect us from what was obviously such a horrifically negative event by repressing some aspects of the trauma so you can't actually remember it. But with a lot of the folks that I work with that have served in some kind of combat, they typically don't have this symptom. They remember everything. And now this one doesn't necessarily count if because of the type of trauma you suffered some kind of head injury and or this was related to the use of alcohol and drugs and that's why you don't remember. So if you got into say like a car accident for instance and you believe that you have PTSD from it, if you don't remember important aspects of it, like say if you were, removed from the car in some way and you don't remember aspects of that, but it's because you hit your head and you have a head injury and you got amnesia from that, that would not count in terms of not being able to remember. So you'd have to get two of the symptoms in this category from other ones. The next symptom is persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. So examples of this could be that I am bad, there's something seriously wrong with me, no one can be trusted, or the world is completely dangerous. Now, listening to this, there's a lot of us who don't have PTSD that might think these things. I mean, looking at the world now, it is incredibly dangerous. But again, the key words here are persistent and exaggerated. So this would be, some of us would have this thought, but for people with PTSD, it is way, 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 way over the top. And this would have had to have started or worsened after experiencing the trauma. So if you just kind of been cynical your whole life and that's something that you've always thought and it hasn't really changed because of the trauma, that would not fit in this category either. The third symptom is self-blame or blaming others that develops because of some kind of distorted thought process about the cause of the trauma or what resulted after that. This is so well displayed in the movie Thank You for Your Service, in which, in terms of self-blame, Miles Teller, who's playing Adam Schumann, or Shu as they call him, dropped his friend Emery, who'd been shot in the head when trying to carry him to safety. The friend survived, but Shu still couldn't forgive himself. He avoids visiting Emery for ages after they get out of the military, and even when Emery keeps telling Shu that he's grateful to be alive and it's not his fault, Shu just keeps repeating, I dropped you. Remember how I said that this self-blame was brought on by a distorted thought process? Well, think about this. Shu was trying to carry his bleeding friend, who probably weighs the same as his entire body weight, down a flight of stairs in a war zone. He was trying to get him from the top floor of a building all the way to the bottom. And as his friend basically passed out when he was being carried, that's 100% of his dead weight that Shu was trying to carry. And when we think about that, that makes it even more difficult because dead weight is much harder to move. That's why in a lot of like self-defense classes, a lot of self-defense strategies, they mention if somebody is trying to transport you to another area to go completely limp because it's harder to carry you that way. It's harder to move you that way. And so imagine the weight that he was carrying. It would be a miracle if Shu didn't drop him. And him saying, I dropped you, is putting too much weight on himself, no pun intended, for something that he couldn't 100% control. I mean, think about it. If you were carrying the entire body weight of somebody else in terms of dead weight around for a period of time, your legs are just gonna give out. You could desire with every fiber of your being to keep carrying that weight and to keep going, just like Shu desired to do the same for Emery. But at some point, your body is going to tell you no. Another great example of self-blame in this movie is with one of the other main characters named Solo. One of their commanding officers or leaders named James Doster died in the field. I believe their car was attacked, and Solo helped to get all the other soldiers to safety, but forgot Doster was with them for a second, and by the time he turned back to get him, it was too late. But here's the context from the movie. Shu is normally the one on patrol with that team, not Doster. He excused Shu from being with his team the next day, though, after his incident with Emery and him being really down on himself for what he feels was the wrong call in changing the route they were driving, which ultimately led to them kind of being ambushed and Emery being shot. So in a moment of especially high stress, if Solo isn't used to Doster being there with the team, Of course, it's so easy to forget that he was there with him. Of course, it's easy to count all the other team members that he's used to being with them and think, okay, this is everybody, until remembering Doster. I mean, and let's be honest here. If any of you watching this are parents, have there been times when you forgot your child, maybe at school or somewhere, and you remember later and you're like, oh shit, gotta go get this kid? Or if you're not a parent, if you were a kid at one point, how many of you had your parent leave you and then, say when they picked you up, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, blah, 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 right? And that's under no stress or pressure at all. I mean, to be fair, as a parent, there's a lot of stresses and pressure. But if we're thinking about in this show being in an actual war zone, in that moment, Solo forgot. It happens. And if a split second was enough for Doster to lose his life, Solo is not the Flash. He's not going to be able, even if he didn't forget, he wouldn't be able to turn back and save his life in 1 second. The outcome probably would have been the same either way. But that's what the mind starts telling us. And then it might start blaming others too. Solo then goes on to blame Shu, saying he should have been there, that he would have seen the bomb. For context, Shu is the one on the team that his job was to, as they were driving, to be looking around and trying to spot any bombs that the enemies may have been laying around for them. And the day that Doster died, the car that they were in was hit by a bomb. So they didn't see it, they ran over it, and then it exploded, leading to his death. And yes, maybe if Shu was there, he would have been able to see the bomb, but also maybe not. I mean, in Warzone, in enemy territory, the enemy forces will hide bombs in ways that are almost undetectable. That's kind of the entire point. And how many people are 100% perfect at their jobs all the time, even if they are well trained? Zero. So the outcome might have still been the same whether Shu was there or not. But with trauma, the brain tries to find control in situations where there is none. If this trauma was because it was my fault or somebody else didn't do something that they should have, it kind of brings the brain a strange sense of comfort in a way because, okay, at least there was something that I could do and I just need to plan better for this next time for this thing not to happen. But if horrible things can happen and I have no control over it and it might just happen without reason, then how the heck is the brain supposed to ensure our survival? But we don't have control over our trauma. It does happen without reason. And these thought distortions are not keeping our brain or us safe. It's just leading to more suffering. Speaking of which, the fourth symptom in Criterion D is a persistent negative emotional state. So constant fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. Trauma really changes the emotional baseline. It can change one's emotional baseline. So maybe instead of starting at a place from neutral and then you go up or down from there based on, if good or bad things happen, a person who experienced trauma and has this symptom may start at a net negative and then just go down from there when things happen. Or if good things happen, okay, maybe they get to that zero, what for other people is just neutral. The next, which is also a symptom of depression, is a notable decrease in interest for or participation in activities that you used to enjoy. And so this is not just because you don't have the opportunity to do that activity. So if you really enjoy fishing, but say it's winter, and so you're not able to go fishing, that wouldn't count under this category because you don't have the opportunity to do it. It's because you actually don't want to do it. Symptom 6 is feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. It's basically like feeling like an outsider in your own world. So imagine if you were going on a visit outside of the country and say maybe you didn't speak the native language, or honestly, even if you spoke the native language, but you just kind of feel weird, like you somewhat don't belong. Maybe you're not used to the customs, or you're not used to how people greet each other or how people do things. You just kind of have the sense that I don't quite belong. That's somewhat like what this feelings of detachment or estrangement is talking about. Then the last symptom in this category is persistent inability to experience positive feelings, positive emotions. So things like inability to experience happiness or satisfaction or loving feelings towards others. So some of what I've heard before is maybe a husband might know logically that he does love his wife, but is struggling to actually feel those feelings towards her. And it's not because there's issues in the marriage. He actually does love her. It's just that he suffered this trauma, and now it's hard for him to feel those feelings. And it's not explicitly stated, but in American Sniper, where Chris is holding his baby daughter and not really showing any emotion, we see that his wife is begging him to stay. And he says, well, you all can wait. His military brothers over there in Iraq can't. So it seems like probably in this regard he is experiencing some of those feelings, probably a mix of the detachment and some of the inability experiencing positive emotions, like holding your baby girl and not really having any kind of strong feelings around that. Now for the final criterion category, Criterion E. This focuses on changes in arousal or reactivity that is associated with the trauma. There are 6 symptoms here, and you need at least 2 to meet a diagnosis. The first symptom in this category is irritable behavior or angry outburst with little or no provocation. We see this in Thank You for Your Service, where Solo is playing a video game and all of a sudden sees Doster's face pop up on screen. It's in his imagination, but he sees it on TV. He freaks out and starts flipping tables, throwing his body against things. His pregnant wife runs to close the bedroom door and hide, and we see him punch the door so hard it nearly breaks. The next symptom is reckless or self-destructive behavior, so driving at insanely high speeds without a seatbelt. Another one that I've heard is actively going out and looking for a fight. So going out and going to certain clubs and maybe saying things to people with hopes that they will actually want to fight you. In Thank You for Your Service, Solo decides to help these random people in dropping off a car full of guns. I can't remember if he knew that there was guns in the car at the time, but they told him there was not great things in the car, to a random location in exchange for some ecstasy. These people aren't even guaranteeing he'll be safe. They say, oh well, since you're military, you can handle yourself if things were to pop off. Yep, talk about reckless. Symptom 3 is hypervigilance, so always being on high alert. What I hear a lot in this category is for people that do go to restaurants, because it's a big crowd there, so for the people that can actually make it to a restaurant, sitting in such a way that you can see the whole place, that your back is to a wall and you can see all the exits, or making sure that when you sit somewhere that people aren't sitting behind you, etc. Symptom 4 is an exaggerated startle response. So something that might make one person jump might make another person with PTSD jump out of their skin. So a fire alarm goes off and somebody with PTSD hits the deck. We see this a little bit in American Sniper, in which we see Chris, he's at like a mechanic shop getting his car worked on. He hears a tool going off, which is incredibly common in a place like this, and it clearly rattles him. He doesn't have such an overt reaction, but for a lot of other folks, we see basically everybody else in the store, they don't think twice because you hear these noises all the time at a mechanic. So even bringing your attention to what's that thing that's going off is something that most people wouldn't even do. Symptom 5, which could also be a symptom of ADHD, is a problem with concentration. Now, to differentiate between the 2 diagnoses, I will ask people what was occurring when they noticed they had some of these issues concentrating. So say if a person realized that they had a trauma memory in the moment and that's what took away their attention, that would be PTSD, versus if, the person was just distracted, that nothing in particular took their attention, they just stopped paying attention, that might be more in line with ADHD and not as much in this category with PTSD. So the final symptom in our final criterion category is some kind of issue with sleep. So this could be difficulties falling asleep or staying asleep. And a lot of times what I see is that this is often highly connected with nightmares. So people mention I'm not sleeping well because I'm waking up all the time in the middle of the night because of nightmares, but it might not necessarily be connected. Okay. Do we see why it's so difficult to get a PTSD diagnosis? You could meet the criteria for criterions A through D, but if you don't have any in Criterion E, sorry, no diagnosis. You could have all symptoms in all categories, but if you only have one instead of having 2 for both criterions D and E, sorry, no diagnosis. The way we so easily throw around the phrase of, oh, that gives me PTSD, or I have PTSD from X, we would think it's the easiest diagnosis to get, that it's a simple formula. Trauma plus issues with trauma equals PTSD. But we see that it's not that simple. It does not work that way at all. To finish out with some of the other things that can go into a diagnosis, I plan to do a whole video at some point about dissociation, so won't go into it in depth now, but know that this is not uncommon at all when it comes to PTSD, to have some kind of dissociation involved. And then as well with diagnosis, there is something that's known as delayed expression of PTSD symptoms. What this is that a person won't exhibit full criterion until 6 months after the trauma, at least 6 months after the trauma happened. This is another point where I want to speak to whoever this might apply to and say, if after experiencing a trauma you kept it together and then it only felt like you were falling apart months after it occurred, you're not going crazy. Maybe you experienced something horrific with some other people, maybe some other friends and family, and you were always the very level headed one. You were kind of the glue. Maybe you counseled others, and now you feel like you need counseling yourself. You're not going crazy. You're traumatized. And thankfully, there are very effective treatments for trauma. Now, some of them focus specifically on certain symptoms. So there's a good bit that focus on nightmares, for instance, because they can be so debilitating for people. And so that might include things like medications. So prazosin's a pretty common one when it comes to nightmares, but that also might include certain therapies. So there are specific nightmare therapies in which some of the things it involves might be going through the nightmare, because usually it's the same and repeats. So going through it and at the parts that are traumatic, kind of rewriting it to where that ending is something that is no longer traumatic. So on the surface, it kind of sounds like lucid dreaming, but it's different. Know that nightmares are symptoms of the root issue, though. So without getting treatment, further treatment for PTSD, these nightmares are going to come back. So obviously, as a psychologist, I'm going to advocate for some therapy here. And not just any type of therapy, but trauma-focused therapy. Some common types include cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, which this is CBT based and focuses a lot on those distorted thought processes that we talked about and how to better combat those. Another is prolonged exposure, or PE, which as it sounds is kind of slower exposure to things that you might fear now because of the trauma. Next is known as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, so EMDR. This focuses on kind of lowering some of the emotional distress and intensity that might be associated with the trauma itself. The next is what's known as written exposure therapy, or WET, and this is a brief, very brief, only 5-session therapy in which talk about trauma, and it involves kind of writing out different aspects and processing through that. And then one of the last ones is known as COPE, and this is a joint treatment when it comes to managing substance abuse and PTSD as well. There's also another treatment called Seeking Safety that does the same thing, but somewhat different. I'll put links in the description. There's going to be a lot in this description, so take a look. I'll put links in the description about sites that you can go to that can help you to find a therapist in your area, and you'll want to make sure to filter specifically for people that might treat trauma or PTSD. And while it might be tempting, myself and other mental health professionals on YouTube are knowledgeable in this area, but we cannot diagnose or give you any kind of good treatment over a YouTube comment. We don't know anything. I don't know anything about you or your history, and that is vital to understanding how to best diagnose and treat you. And so while it might be a little bit scary or time consuming or expensive to go to a therapist, just think about what the cost is in your life right now of not going to therapy at the stage that you're at.
I know this don't look like much of a life, but every morning I get up, I'm grateful. I'm grateful I'm alive.